When my son's fiancé publicly disgraced my wife at our anniversary gala in Atlanta, she had no idea about the corporate ledger sitting in my trunk. 200 guests were gathered at the Piedmont Country Club. The ballroom smelled of roasted garlic, expensive gardenias, and the crisp, over-conditioned air of old Southern wealth. The jazz trio in the corner was playing something slow and soft. I was standing near the terrace doors watching Margaret. She wore a silver silk gown we had picked out together during a weekend trip to Charleston. She looked radiant, talking with her sisters, holding a glass of club soda because her stomach was still sensitive from her surgery. Vanessa made her move near the center banquet table. It looked like an accident at first, a clumsy misstep by a younger woman in too much of a hurry. Margaret was walking toward the carving station. Vanessa, holding a full glass of Merlot, stepped deliberately onto the trailing hem of Margaret's silk gown. Margaret stumbled. The fabric pulled tight, pinning her legs. She turned around to apologize, assuming she had stepped in Vanessa's way. I saw Margaret's mouth form the word sorry. Vanessa didn't accept the apology. She planted her feet and shoved my wife backward with both hands. Margaret went down hard. She crashed sideways into the centerpiece table. A massive decorative glass sculpture took her weight for a fraction of a second before shattering. The sound of breaking glass cut through the jazz music like a gunshot. Margaret hit the hardwood floor. The Merlot Vanessa had been holding splashed across Margaret's silver dress, looking violently dark against the pale silk. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The jazz trio stopped playing. 200 people froze. I didn't run. I set my water glass down on a passing waiter's tray and looked at my son Connor. He was standing less than 10 feet from his mother. I waited for him to rush over, to pull her up, to scream at Vanessa. He didn't move an inch. Instead, Connor stepped up to Vanessa, pulled her against his side, and let out a loud, echoing, mocking laugh. It was an ugly, wet sound. I walked through the stunned crowd. The silence was so heavy you could hear my leather shoes clicking against the oak floor. I knelt beside my wife. She was shaking. A small cut on her forearm was bleeding, mixing with the wine soaked into her sleeve. Her eyes were wide, welling with tears of pure, unadulterated humiliation. I pulled a linen napkin from the nearest table and gently wiped her cheek. "I've got you," I whispered. I helped her to her feet, kept my arm tight around her waist, and handed her off to her sister, Coralie. "Take her to the foyer. Wait by the doors." Then I turned and walked up to the head table. I took the microphone from the podium. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioner humming in the ceiling vents. "Connor," I said into the mic. My voice was completely flat. "Your mother apologizes for ruining your evening." I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out the crisp, white envelope I had been carrying all night. Inside was a certified cashier's check for $200,000. It was the money he had been begging for over the last 6 months, the seed money he claimed he needed to buy into a new logistics franchise. I pulled the check out, held it up under the chandelier light, and tore it straight down the middle. I stacked the halves, tore them again, and kept tearing until the paper was nothing but confetti. I dropped the shreds directly into his champagne glass. Connor's face flushed dark red. He snatched the microphone out of my hand. The speakers shrieked with feedback. "Keep your chump change, old man," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly through the system. "Vanessa's father is making me senior managing director at Apex Freight on Friday. We don't need your pathetic handouts. You've been a small-timer your whole life, and you expect me to beg for scraps? We're done." At the back of the room, Vanessa's parents, Bowen and Blythe Farrow, started clapping. A few of their guests joined in, a scattering of arrogant applause echoing in the massive room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I just looked at the son I had raised, took in the sneer on his face, and walked away. I drove my trembling, crying wife home in total silence. The drive from Piedmont to our house in the suburbs took 40 minutes. Margaret stared out the passenger window into the dark. Every few minutes, she would wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. I kept my hand resting on her knee. Connor had just walked into a trap he was far too arrogant to foresee. My son thinks I'm a retired high school vice principal. He thinks we live off a modest state pension, Social Security, and whatever we saved in my 401k. He constantly rolls his eyes at my 12-year-old Toyota sedan. He complains about the size of our television. He calls me a failure behind my back. And tonight, to my face. What he has never known is that 40 years ago, I started buying up cheap, undeveloped industrial land near the coast. 10 years after that, I founded the commercial property firm that now owns the entire Savannah Port Terminal, the exact terminal where Apex Freight operates its entire southeastern hub. I hid my wealth. I kept my job at the high school. We lived in a normal house in a normal neighborhood because I grew up with nothing, and I wanted my son to build his own character instead of waiting around for a trust fund to solve his problems. It backfired. He didn't build character. He built resentment. Furthermore, Bowen Farrow isn't a wealthy corporate mogul. Apex Freight has been my tenant for 20 years. I see their financials. They have been secretly hemorrhaging cash for the last 4 quarters. They lost their 2 biggest shipping contracts to a competitor in Jacksonville, and they are 3 weeks away from mandatory bankruptcy. Bowen didn't have 2 pennies to rub together to fund a new partnership. So if Apex is broke, and Connor has no savings of his own, how exactly did my son buy his way into a managing director seat? When we got home, I drew a hot bath for Margaret. I helped her out of the ruined dress, bandaged the cut on her arm, and put her to bed. She fell asleep quickly, her body exhausted by the adrenaline and the trauma. At 1:30 a.m., I went down to my home office. I locked the door behind me. I turned on my desk lamp, opened our private family vault, and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I logged directly into the county property records system. That was when I found the mechanism of his betrayal. 5 months ago, Margaret underwent major spinal surgery at Emory Hospital. The recovery was brutal. For the first week, she was heavily medicated on high-dose narcotics just to tolerate the pain of sitting up. I rarely left her side, but one Tuesday evening I stepped out for 45 minutes to grab us some real food from a diner down the street. According to the digital notary logs, that was the exact window of time Connor brought a shady mobile notary named Luz into Margaret's hospital room. I stared at the scanned documents on my screen, my vision blurred around the edges. Connor had convinced his heavily drugged mother to sign a stack of papers he claimed were insurance consent forms for the hospital billing department. In reality, it was a durable power of attorney over her personal real estate holdings. Connor used that stolen signature to transfer the deed of our coastal cottage on Tybee Island to Apex Freight. He used it as collateral for a private corporate loan. Tybee Island, 30 years of family memories. The house where Margaret spent her summers planting hydrangeas. The dock where I taught Connor how to sail when he was 8 years old. He handed it over to Bowen Farrow to save a dying logistics firm. And as I scrolled to the second page of the county filings, my stomach turned to lead. He hadn't stopped at Tybee. He had attached a secondary mortgage against our primary home in Atlanta, the very roof over his mother's head. He leveraged everything we owned to buy a fake title from a fraudster. A single phone call to the district attorney would freeze the transfer immediately. It would be an open and shut case. The hospital records of Margaret's medication alone would invalidate the notary stamp. But calling the DA would also send Connor to federal prison for grand larceny and elder financial fraud. He would serve a minimum of 10 years. I sat in the dim desk light for a long time. I thought about the sound of his laugh in the ballroom. I thought about Margaret bleeding on the hardwood floor. I opened a separate folder on my desktop and pulled up the old master lease agreement from 1998 between my holding company and Apex Freight. I scrolled down to section 14. Buried in the legal text was an automatic acceleration clause I had my lawyers draft decades ago. Any illegal transfer of title or involvement in fraudulent financial collateral by the tenant immediately voids the lease, triggers an instant $800,000 cash acceleration penalty, and forces an emergency public auction of all company assets within 48 hours to satisfy the debt. I picked up my cell phone and dialed my senior attorney, Gerald. It was 2:15 a.m. He answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "I need you at your desk," I said. "I'm awake," Gerald replied, hearing the tone of my voice. "What happened?" "Connor stole the Tybee deed and leveraged the primary house. He gave it to Apex Freight." Silence on the line. "Then, I can have an injunction filed by 8:00 a.m. The DA will have a warrant for Connor by noon." "No," I instructed softly. "Don't file the fraud injunction tonight. Bowen Farrow is holding a press conference tomorrow afternoon to announce Connor's new partnership. Let them sign the final papers on camera. Let them take the money. I want them to walk directly into the snare. You trigger Section 14, you bankrupt Apex by Friday," Gerald warned. "But if Connor's name is on that fraudulent collateral when the hammer falls, the federal investigators won't care that he's your son. He'll go down with Farrow." "I know." I hung up the phone and closed the laptop. I sat in the dark office listening to the house settle. At 6:00 a.m., I was already drinking my second cup of black coffee when my phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was Gerald. "We have a problem," he said. He didn't sound tired anymore. He sounded tense. I put my junior associate, Caden, on the county records pull. "We missed something in the secondary filings. Farrow isn't just holding the Tybee deed as collateral. He's actively liquidating it." I gripped the edge of the granite counter. "Explain." "Apex is bleeding out faster than we thought. Farrow knows bankruptcy is coming. He took the Tybee deed Connor gave him and flipped it to a hard money lender in Midtown named Thad Wolf. Farrow used Tybee to secure a quick $500,000 cash bridge loan to keep Apex's payroll afloat for the next month. So Wolfie holds the paper on Tybee." "It gets worse," Gerald said. "The bridge loan defaulted yesterday. Farrow missed the payment. Wolf is a predator. He's already filed the preliminary paperwork for a non-judicial foreclosure. If we don't intercept this, Wolf auctions Tybee on the courthouse steps next Tuesday. The moment that happens, it's out of Farrow's hands. Triggering the lease acceleration won't get the house back because Apex won't own it anymore. Wolf will." I looked out the kitchen window. The sun was just starting to break over the oak trees in the backyard. "Where is Thad Wolf's office?" I asked. "A strip mall off Cheshire Bridge Road." "You can't go in there," Gerald said quickly. "If you walk in and try to buy the debt, Wolfie will know the property is valuable. He'll jack the price or refuse to sell until the auction." "Set up a shell LLC," I said. "Name it something generic. Peachtree Holdings. Wire $600,000 from my primary investment account into a cashier's check under the shell's name. I'll be at your office in an hour to pick it up." "You're going to pay off Connor's stolen debt?" "I'm going to buy the paper," I corrected him. "Once I own the debt, I become Farrow's primary creditor. Then I don't just evict Apex. I liquidate them." I hung up before Gerald could argue. I walked upstairs to check on Margaret. She was still asleep, her breathing shallow and even. The bruising on her shoulder was already turning a deep, sickly purple. I pulled the blanket up to her neck, went to my closet, and put on a cheap, off-the-rack gray suit I usually wore to school board meetings. I wanted to look exactly like the tired, low-level pensioner my son thought I was. By 9:30 a.m., I parked my 12-year-old sedan outside a rundown commercial plaza. Thad Wolf's office was sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a discount liquor store. The sign on the door just read Wolf Capital. I walked in. The front lobby smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. A receptionist barely looked up from her phone. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Wolf regarding the Tybee Island collateral assigned by Apex Freight." 5 minutes later, I was sitting across from Thad Wolf. He was a thick-necked man in his 50s, wearing a tight dress shirt and a gold watch that looked heavy enough to sink a boat. He leaned back in his leather chair, looking me up and down. He took in the cheap suit, the scuffed shoes. "You're the father," Wolfie said, tapping a pen on his desk. "Connor's dad, the retired principal." I didn't react. Word travels fast. Farrow told me about the property. Said it it was family land. I assume you found out your kid mortgaged your beach house and you're here to beg me for an extension. Wolf smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. I don't do extensions. Pharaoh defaulted. The house goes to auction Tuesday. Unless you have $540,000 in your pocket right now to satisfy the principal and the penalty fees, you're wasting my time. I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out the cashier's check Gerald had drafted. I placed it face down on the desk and slid it across the glass surface. Wolf picked it up. He flipped it over. His smile vanished. 600,000. Wolf read aloud. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. Drawn from Peachtree Holdings, LLC. What is this? I am representing a private buyer. I lied smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly flat. We want the Tybee paper. You take the check, assign the debt to the LLC, and you walk away with a $60,000 profit for doing absolutely nothing. Today, Wolfie stared at the check. Greed fought with suspicion in his eyes. Why doesn't this buyer just wait for the auction? They could probably get it cheaper. My client doesn't like public auctions. He values discretion. I leaned forward slightly. Take the money, Mr. Wolf. You're a bridge lender. You want cash liquidity, not coastal real estate you have to maintain and flip. Wolf hesitated, but the sight of the certified funds was too much. He pressed a button on his intercom. Prepare a debt assignment and transfer of lien for the Tybee property. Bring it in here now. 20 minutes later, I walked out of the strip mall with the original Tybee deed and the promissory note in my briefcase. I owned the debt. I held the noose around Bowen Farrow's neck. I got back into my car and turned the key. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I answered it. Hello? Are you done playing the victim yet? It was Blythe Farrow, Vanessa's mother. Her voice dripped with the same aristocratic condescension I had heard at the country club. Blythe, I said calmly. I'm calling because Vanessa is upset, Blythe said, though she didn't sound upset at all. She sounded triumphant. Your little stunt with the check last night was incredibly tacky. But Bowen is a forgiving man. The press conference for Connor's managing director announcement is at 3 p.m. at the Apex corporate office. Bowen thinks you should be there to support your son and to apologize to my daughter. An apology, I repeated. Connor is stepping into the real world now, Blythe continued. He's going to be handling multi-million-dollar logistics contracts. He doesn't need his small-town father embarrassing him in front of industry professionals. Come to the press conference. Stand quietly in the back. Show him you support his success. If you can manage that, we might let you attend the wedding. I looked at the leather briefcase sitting on the passenger seat. Inside were the documents that proved her husband was a bankrupt fraud and my son was a felon. I'll be there, I said. Good. Wear something presentable for once. The line went dead. I set the phone down. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward Gerald's office downtown. We had 4 hours to finalize the acceleration paperwork. When I walked into the firm, Gerald was waiting for me in the glass-walled conference room. Caden, the young associate, was sitting next to him, looking completely pale. He had a stack of printed emails spread across the mahogany table. I have the Tybee paper, I said, setting my briefcase down. I own the debt. Draw up the notice of default. We serve Pharaoh the moment he shakes Connor's hand at the podium. Gerald didn't look relieved. He looked sick. What is it? I asked, stopping at the edge of the table. Caden pulled the deep communication logs during discovery on the secondary mortgage, Gerald said quietly. He pointed to the stack of printed emails. The lien on your primary house in Atlanta, the one Connor took out. I know about the lien, I said. He forged Margaret's signature with a dirty notary. No, Caden spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. Sir, the Tybee documents were signed 5 months ago, during the hospital stay. That was the notary fraud. Caden swallowed hard. The secondary mortgage on your primary house? It wasn't signed 5 months ago. It was executed yesterday morning, electronically, from your home IP address. I stared at the young lawyer. That's impossible. Margaret was with me all day preparing for the gala. Gerald pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a digital DocuSign certificate. It wasn't Connor, Gerald said heavily. Margaret signed it. She authorized the secondary mortgage. She gave Connor the money. I looked from the piece of paper to Gerald, then down at the DocuSign certificate. The silence in the glass-walled conference room was heavy. I picked up the printed sheet. The IP address listed at the bottom matched our home router. The digital timestamp read 10:15 a.m. yesterday morning. I traced my steps backward. I tried to picture exactly where I was at 10:15 a.m. Yesterday, I had been at the dry cleaners picking up my tuxedo, and then I drove over to the florist in Buckhead to make sure the gardenias for the gala centerpieces were being loaded onto the delivery van. I had been gone for exactly 2 hours. She was sober, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't talking to the lawyers. She's been off the heavy pain medication for 4 months. She was perfectly lucid. She knew exactly what she was doing. Gerald folded his hands on the mahogany table. I'm sorry, my friend. I really am. But this complicates the execution. If your wife authorized the lien on your primary residence, it's not criminal fraud. It's a legally binding joint encumbrance. We can still drop the hammer on the Tybee Island property because of the notary forgery from 5 months ago. But the primary house, if she signed the mortgage, Connor gets that money clean. I looked at the principal amount listed on the secondary mortgage filing. $450,000. Where did the money go? I asked Caden, not looking up from the paper. The young associate typed furiously on his laptop. The funds cleared at 2:00 p.m. yesterday afternoon. They were wired directly from the lender into a holding account under the name Apex Freight Partners, LLC. It's a brand new entity, filed with the state last week. Connor is listed as the sole managing member. It hit me like a physical blow. Bowen Farrow wasn't making Connor a partner out of the goodness of his heart, and he certainly wasn't doing it because of Connor's business acumen. Connor was buying his way into a dying company using his mother's home equity. He was injecting almost $500,000 of fresh cash into Apex to secure the title of senior managing director. And Farrow, desperate for liquidity to stave off immediate bankruptcy, was gladly taking it. Print it all, I told Caden. The wire transfer receipts, the DocuSign certificates, certificates, the LLC filings, everything. I left Gerald's office and drove back to the suburbs. The anger that had been simmering in my chest since the country club was gone. It was replaced by a cold, hollow void. Margaret, my wife of 35 years. I pulled my sedan into the driveway. It was just past noon. I unlocked the front door and walked in. The house was quiet. I found Margaret in the sunroom at the back of the house. She was sitting in her favorite wicker chair, a mug of chamomile tea resting on the small glass table next to her. She was wearing a thick beige cardigan, but the collar was loose enough that I could still see the edge of the dark purple bruise creeping up her neck from where she hit the centerpiece table last night. She looked pale and exhausted. She looked up when I walked in. She forced a weak, unsteady smile. "You're home early." I didn't smile back. I walked over and dropped the stack of papers onto the glass table next to her tea. The DocuSign certificate was right on top. Margaret looked down at the papers. Her face went completely bloodless. "Connor came over yesterday morning while I was at the florist," I said. My voice was quiet. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. "He sat right here in this room, and he asked you to take out a $500,000 mortgage on our home." Margaret closed her eyes. Her hands, resting in her lap, started to tremble. "Why, Margaret?" She didn't answer right away. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching in the fine lines around her mouth. "He was desperate," she whispered. "Desperate for what? A fake job title? A seat at a bankrupt table?" Her eyes snapped open. "Bankrupt? What are you talking about?" He said Bowen Farrow was offering him the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to be a real, equity-holding partner in a massive logistics firm. He said it was his only shot to prove himself. Prove himself to who? To you. She looked up at me, her eyes full of a complicated defensive grief. "He told me you laughed in his face when he asked for a business loan. He said you told him he would never amount to anything, that he was a failure, and that you were cutting him out of the will." I stared at her. I never said that. I refused to hand him $200,000 because his business plan was a napkin sketch. I wanted him to learn how to secure real capital. I wanted him to work for it. He said Vanessa's parents were threatening to call off the wedding. Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "He said they wanted proof he could provide for her. He was crying, David. He knelt right where you're standing. He told me this partnership at Apex would change his life, but he needed the buy-in capital by yesterday afternoon, or Farrow was giving the seat to someone else. He begged me. And you gave him half the equity in our home. It's a guaranteed return," she pleaded, repeating the lines I knew my son had rehearsed and fed to her. He showed me the financial projections. Apex is a $50 million company. He said he would pay off the secondary mortgage in 6 months, with interest. He just needed the bridge. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Apex is bankrupt, Margaret. They lost their 2 primary shipping contracts to a competitor in Jacksonville last quarter. They are 3 weeks away from defaulting on everything." I watched her process the words. "Bowen Farrow isn't bringing Connor in as a partner to run the company. He's bringing him in to strip him for parts. Farrow needed cash to make payroll. Connor gave him $450,000 of our money yesterday." "No." She shook her head, instinctively rejecting it. "Connor wouldn't. It gets worse." I reached into my leather briefcase, which I had set on the floor beside me, and pulled out the original Tybee Island deed and the promissory note from Thad Wolf. I laid them on the table next to the DocuSign certificate. "Connor didn't just come to you yesterday. 5 months ago, when you were in Emory recovering from your spinal fusion, when you were heavily sedated on oxycodone, Connor brought a mobile notary into your hospital room." Margaret stared at the Tybee deed. She reached out and touched the thick embossed paper with a shaking finger. "He told you it was an insurance consent form for the billing department," I said softly. "It was a durable power of attorney. He used it to sign over the Tybee cottage to Apex as collateral for a separate corporate loan. Farrow defaulted on that loan yesterday. A hard money lender in Midtown was going to foreclose on the beach house on Tuesday." I sat there and watched my wife break. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing realization. She looked at the forged signature on the Tybee deed, then back to the digital certificate for our primary home. The son she had protected, the son she had secretly funded behind my back, hadn't just made a bad business decision. He had manipulated her. He had drugged her compliance 5 months ago. And then he had emotionally blackmailed her yesterday morning. And last night, barely 10 hours after taking nearly $1 million of her net worth, he had stood in a ballroom and laughed while his fiancé shoved her to the floor. Margaret covered her face with both hands. The sob that tore out of her throat was guttural and raw. It was the sound of total, absolute devastation. I didn't reach out to touch her. I didn't try to comfort her. I just sat there and let her cry. After several long minutes, she lowered her hands. Her eyes were red, her face streaked and blotchy. The soft, conciliatory mother who always made excuses for her boy was gone. The woman looking back at me was rigid with fury. "The press conference is at 3, she said. Her voice was raspy, but it didn't shake. "I'm going," I said. "Blythe Farrow called me this morning. She demanded I show up to support him. She told me I needed to apologize to Vanessa." Margaret stood up. She winced as her bruised shoulders shifted, but she didn't stop. She pulled the edges of her cardigan together. "I'm going with you," she said. I looked up at her, and entirely silent. Margaret was wearing a sharp, dark navy pantsuit. It was tailored, structured, and completely covered the bandages on her forearm and the bruising on her neck. She looked like armor. The Apex building was a sprawling 3-story glass and steel structure overlooking the active port terminals. It looked impressive and imposing from the outside, but I knew the truth. I owned the dirt it sat on, and the company inside was a hollow, rotting shell. We walked through the sliding glass doors into the main atrium. A massive vinyl banner hung from the second-floor balcony, Apex Freight welcoming our new senior managing director, Connor. They had set up rows of velvet-cushioned folding chairs in the expansive lobby. A wooden podium was placed in front of a step and repeat backdrop plastered with the Apex logo. A few local business reporters were mingling near a catered coffee station in the corner. Staff were walking around with silver trays of champagne flutes. Bowen Farrow was playing the part of the successful magnate perfectly. He was standing near the front row, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, shaking hands and laughing loudly with a group of terminal managers. Vanessa was standing right next to him, wearing a tight designer dress, clinging tightly to Connor's arm. Connor looked incredibly smug. He was wearing a brand-new Rolex Daytona on his left wrist, a watch that cost $40,000, undoubtedly bought with the cash he skimmed off his mother's mortgage. We stood at the back of the room near a large potted ficus. The lobby was crowded, and we hadn't been noticed yet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Gerald. I stepped slightly away from the crowd and put the phone to my ear. "We're locked," Gerald said. The ambient noise of his law office echoed in the background. "I just pushed the final digital filings through the county clerk's office. You are officially recorded as the primary line holder on the Tybe debt, and I have the commercial lease default notice printed and ready to execute. Do I have the green light to trigger the acceleration clause?" I looked across the room. Connor was leaning in, whispering something into Vanessa's ear. She threw her head back and laughed. It was the exact same mocking laugh from the country club. "Not yet," I told Gerald, my eyes locked on my son. "Wait for my signal." I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Margaret reached out and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. A sudden hush fell over the room. Bowen Farrow stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone. The sound system thumped loudly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bowen's booming authoritative voice filled the atrium. "Friends, colleagues, and esteemed partners, we are gathered here today to announce a monumental shift in the leadership of Apex Freight. For 20 years, this company has been the backbone of Southeastern logistics. And today, we are securing our future for the next 20. He extended a hand, gesturing broadly toward Connor. "I am thrilled to announce that Connor has joined us not only as our new senior managing director, but as a full equity partner. Connor brings fresh vision, aggressive capital, and the kind of relentless drive we need to dominate this industry." The crowd applauded politely. Vanessa clapped the loudest, her diamond engagement ring catching the overhead lobby lights. Bowen reached down and held up a thick, leather-bound binder. "In front of these witnesses and the press, we are finalizing the partnership agreement. A new era for Apex begins right now." Connor stepped up to the podium. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and took a silver fountain pen from his inside pocket. He looked out at the crowd, soaking in the attention. His chest puffed out with unearned pride. Then, his eyes scanned the back of the room and landed on me. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He saw me standing there in my cheap, off-the-rack gray suit. He didn't see Margaret right away. She was partially obscured by the broad leaves of the ficus plant. I saw his posture stiffen. He looked at me with a mixture of pure defiance and deep disgust, as if my mere presence in the room was a stain on his perfect moment. He leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Bowen. This is a big day." He paused, letting his gaze lock onto mine. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who settled for mediocrity, people who lacked the courage to take risks, to bet on themselves, to build something real." He didn't blink. "Today, I'm stepping out of that shadow. I'm putting my own capital on the line to build a legacy. I'm doing what my own father never had the vision or the backbone to do." A few people in the front row shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bowen chuckled into the mic, patting Connor hard on the back. "Well said, son. Let's make it official." Connor opened the leather binder on the podium. He signed the first page with a flourish, flipped the heavy parchment, and signed the second. It was done. The money was locked in. The fraudulent collateral was officially bound to the company's ledger. The snare was pulled tight. I let go of Margaret's hand. I stepped out from behind the ficus tree and started walking down the center aisle. The crowd parted slightly as I moved. People in the front rows turned their heads, their polite, low-level murmurs dying down as they took in my scuffed shoes and the cheap gray suit. I didn't rush. I kept my pace steady, my eyes locked on the podium where my son stood. Connor's sneer deepened as I approached. He leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing through the glass atrium. "Glad you could make it, Dad. A little late, but I'm sure someone can find you a seat in the back." A few of the executives chuckled. Bowen Farrow smiled, playing the magnanimous host. I didn't look at Connor. I walked straight past him and stopped directly in front of Bowen. I placed my worn leather briefcase on the podium, right on top of the open, freshly signed partnership agreement. I snapped the brass locks open. The sharp, metallic click was incredibly loud in the suddenly quiet room. Bowen frowned, his polished executive mask slipping just a fraction. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing? We're in the middle of a press event." I reached into the briefcase, pulled out a single manila envelope, and slid it across the smooth wood of the podium. "You're in the middle of a liquidation, Bowen." Bowen stared at the envelope, then looked up at me. He let out a short, sharp laugh meant for the crowd. "Security, could we get this gentleman out of here? It seems Connor's father has had a bit too much excitement for one day." No one moved. The room had gone dead silent. Even the jazz music playing softly over the lobby speakers seemed to fade into the background. "Open it," I said. My voice didn't carry to the back of the room, but the reporters milling around the second row definitely heard me. I saw two of them pull out their phones and start recording. Bowen hesitated. His eyes darted to the cameras, then back to the envelope. He ripped the flap open and pulled out the thick stack of legal papers. The notice of default sat right on top, pinned to the assignment of debt from Thad Wolf. I watched his eyes scan the page. I watched the exact moment the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. As of 10:30 this morning, I told him, keeping my tone entirely conversational, Peachtree Holdings LLC acquired the defaulted paper on the Tybee Island property. The bridge loan you took from Thad Wolf, the one you defaulted on yesterday. Bowen swallowed hard. His hands actually started to shake, rattling the heavy parchment. You bought Thad's paper. I did, which makes me your primary secured creditor." Connor stepped forward, his face face flushed dark red with anger and embarrassment. Dad, stop this. You're making a fool of yourself. You don't have the money to buy corporate debt. You're a retired high school administrator. I finally turned to look at my son. I'm your landlord, Connor. Connor stopped. He blinked, the anger faltering for a second. What? I turned back to Bowen and pulled the original 1998 commercial lease agreement from the briefcase. I laid it out next to the default notice and pointed to the highlighted text. Section 14. Bowen. Any illegal transfer of title or involvement in fraudulent collateral immediately voids the master lease for this terminal. It triggers an $800,000 cash acceleration penalty, due immediately. Bowen was staring at the lease. He was staring at the signature at the bottom of the page. My signature. You're David, Bowen whispered, the realization hitting him so hard he physically swayed backward. He looked from the document, to my cheap suit, to my face. You're the holding company. You own the port. I do. And as of right now, you are in default. The emergency public auction of Apex Freight's assets begins in 48 hours. The atrium erupted. The reporters at the back started pushing forward, questions flying through the air, camera shutters clicking rapidly. The polite crowd of terminal managers and investors suddenly turned into a hive of panicked whispering. People were standing up, pulling out their phones, calling their brokers. Blythe Farrow rushed to the podium, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She grabbed her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. Bowen, what is he talking about? Fix this. Bowen ignored her. He rounded on Connor, his face twisted in absolute panic and fury. You told me the Tybee deed was clean. You looked me in the eye and said it was a family trust transfer. It is. Connor shouted over the noise, his voice high-pitched and desperate. It's my family's property. My mother authorized it. It's perfectly legal. I didn't authorize a damn thing. Margaret's voice cut through the chaos like a surgical blade. She was standing at the end of the center aisle. She hadn't raised her voice, but the sheer, unwavering authority in her tone made the executive standing near her step back. She walked slowly toward the podium, her posture perfect, her dark navy suit immaculate. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Vanessa or Bowen. She only looked at the boy she had raised. Connor paled, the arrogance finally, completely shattered. Mom, what are you doing here? Margaret stopped at the base of the podium. You brought a mobile notary into my hospital room at Emory, Connor, while I was on high-dose narcotics. You forged my signature to steal a house that has been in my family for 30 years. Connor stumbled backward a half step, hitting the step and repeat backdrop. No, Mom. You signed it. You knew what you were doing. We talked about it. I have the notary logs, I said calmly, tapping the stack of papers in my briefcase. I have the hospital dosage charts. It's elder financial fraud. It's grand larceny. And Bowen, I looked at the panicked CEO, who was currently hyperventilating. You accepted the stolen collateral. You leveraged it, which makes you an accessory to a federal crime. Bowen looked like he was going to throw up. He grabbed the heavy leather binder containing the partnership agreement Connor had signed exactly 3 minutes ago. He frantically tried to rip the thick pages out. It's void, Bowen shouted, his voice cracking loudly over the microphone. The partnership is void. I had no knowledge of the fraud. We sever all ties with this boy immediately. Vanessa gasped, stepping forward. Daddy, shut up, Vanessa, Bowen snapped. He managed to tear the parchment paper in half. He threw the ripped pages directly at Connor's chest. Get out of my building. You're done. Connor stood there, the torn pieces of his fake title fluttering to the floor around his expensive leather shoes. He looked completely lost. He looked like a terrified child who had just realized the vase he broke was irreplaceable. He turned to Vanessa. Ness, tell your dad we're partners. We have the LC. We have the $450,000. He reached for her hand. Vanessa physically recoils, taking a quick step backward to hide behind her mother. Don't touch me, she said, her voice dripping with venomous disgust. You're a criminal. You lied to us. I didn't lie, Connor pleaded, his voice echoing awkwardly in the massive room. The reporters were dead silent now, recording every word. I have the cash. Mom gave it to me. The secondary mortgage on the Atlanta house. It cleared yesterday afternoon. $450,000. It's in the Apex Freight Partners account right now. We can still save the company. Bowen, we can pay off the bridge loan. Bowen stopped. He lowered the leather binder. He looked at Connor. Then he slowly turned his head to look at his daughter. A very strange, very cold silence fell over the Farrow family. Blythe slowly lowered her hand from her husband's arm. She stared at her daughter. Vanessa? Vanessa didn't meet her mother's eyes. She smoothed the front of her designer dress, her expression hardening into something entirely unreadable. The panicked fiancé routine vanished in the span of a single heartbeat. Connor, Vanessa said quietly. Check the account. Connor froze. What? Check the L account on your phone. Connor pulled his phone out of his pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He opened his banking app. The facial recognition failed twice. He typed in his passcode, his thumb slipping on the glass screen. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I watched his breath hitch in his throat. It's zero, Connor whispered. He tapped the screen frantically, pulling down to refresh the page. The balance is zero. Where is it? Where's the money? He looked up at Vanessa. You made me a co-signer on the LLC yesterday afternoon, Vanessa said. Her voice was perfectly flat, entirely devoid of the bubbly, fawning affection she had displayed 10 minutes ago. To prove you trusted me. To prove we were a team. Where is the money, Vanessa? Connor's voice rose to a terrified scream. I wired it, she said simply. This morning, while you were at the dry cleaners picking up your suit. Bowen took a heavy step toward his daughter. Wired it where? To the Apex operating account? Tell me you put it in the corporate operating account so I can make payroll. Vanessa finally looked directly at her father. No, Daddy, I didn't put it in the dying company. She lifted her chin, defiant and utterly cold. I wired it to a private offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. Under my name. The atrium exploded with noise again, but Bowen couldn't hear it. He looked like he had been shot. You stole it? From your own father's company? You're bankrupt, Dad. Vanessa snapped, dropping the dutiful daughter act completely. completely. You've been bleeding us dry for a year. You sold my mother's jewelry to keep the lights on last month. Did you think I didn't know? Did you think I was going to let you drag me down into poverty with you? She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Connor, who was still staring at his phone in shock. He handed me $500,000 of liquid cash. It was the only real asset left in this entire pathetic room, so I took it. Consider it my early inheritance. I stood at the podium, watching the implosion. This was the complication I hadn't seen coming. My son hadn't just stolen his mother's legacy to buy a fake job. He had handed it directly to a grifter who was even more ruthless and desperate than he was. Connor dropped his phone. It hit the marble floor and cracked. He dropped to his knees, right there in front of the podium, in front of the flashing cameras, in front of his mother. "Mom," he begged, looking up at Margaret. Tears were streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly styled hair. "Mom, please, do something. She took it. She took your money. You have to call the bank. You have to stop the wire." Margaret looked down at him. The dark purple bruising on her neck was barely visible above the collar of her suit, but I knew it was there. I knew how much it hurt every time she turned her head. She didn't reach out to touch him. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. "It wasn't my money anymore, Connor," Margaret said softly. "You saw to that." Connor stayed on his knees. He reached out to grab the hem of Margaret's trousers, but she took a measured step backward, leaving his hand grasping empty air. I picked up my briefcase from the podium. I snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp click echoed over the sudden, frantic whispering of the reporters. "Let's go," I said softly to my wife. I put my hand on the small of her back. We turned around and walked down the center aisle. Behind us, the atrium dissolved into absolute chaos. Bowen Farrow started screaming at Vanessa, his voice entirely unhinged, demanding the offshore account numbers. Blythe was sobbing, trying to grab her daughter's arm, but Vanessa shoved her mother away with a vicious sneer. The reporters surged forward like bloodhounds, shouting questions about the stolen funds and the forged deed. Connor didn't yell. As we reached the sliding glass doors, I glanced back one last time. My son was still sitting on the marble floor, completely alone in the middle of a screaming crowd, staring blankly at a cracked phone screen. We walked out into the Savannah heat. I unlocked the 12-year-old sedan, opened the passenger door for Margaret, and drove us away from the terminal. 48 hours later, the emergency auction went live. It wasn't a grand spectacle. It happened online, moderated by a county clerk. I sat in Gerald's office with a cup of black coffee and watched the digital timer count down. Through Peachtree Holdings, I bought Apex Freight's entire fleet of trucks, their remaining active contracts, and their warehouse equipment for pennies on the dollar. The money I paid went directly into satisfying the debt they owed me. By Tuesday afternoon, Apex Freight ceased to exist. Bowen Farrow lost everything. His home in Buckhead went into foreclosure the following month. Vanessa didn't get her Cayman Islands payout. She thought she was untouchable, but she wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was just a greedy amateur. The wire transfer was flagged by the Federal Clearinghouse 3 hours after the press conference. The bankruptcy court issued an emergency freeze on all Apex-affiliated accounts. The $450,000 she tried to steal was locked in international escrow. She was detained at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport on a Sunday morning, trying to board a flight to Nassau. The courts eventually returned the frozen funds to the original hard money lender. Margaret and I still had to cover the penalty fees and the accrued interest on the secondary mortgage she had signed, but I wrote a check from my primary investment account and cleared the lien on our home in Atlanta. It cost me $60,000 out of pocket to clean up my son's mess. It was the last dime I would ever spend on him. Connor was indicted 6 weeks later. The district attorney didn't need much help from us. The digital notary logs, the Emory Hospital dosage records, and lose the notary's immediate confession to avoid jail time were enough to secure a grand jury indictment for elder financial fraud and felony forgery. He came to the house once, a week before his arraignment. He stood on the front porch and rang the doorbell for 20 minutes. He cried. He begged. He promised he would change, that he understood now, that he just needed one more chance. I watched him through the security camera feed. Margaret sat on the couch in the living room drinking her tea, staring straight ahead at the blank television screen. Neither of us got up to open the door. Eventually, he stopped crying. He got back into his car and drove away. We went to Tybee Island for the rest of the summer. The weather was warm, and the coastal breeze kept the Georgia humidity at bay. The cottage smelled exactly like it always did. Pine needles, salt water, and old wood. I spent the mornings fixing up the dock where I used to teach him how to sail. Margaret spent her afternoons planting new hydrangeas along the front walkway. One evening in late August, we sat on the back deck watching the tide roll in. The bruise on Margaret's neck had completely faded. The cut on her arm was a thin, pale scar. She was holding a glass of iced tea. She set it down on the wooden railing and looked out at the water. "He's pleading guilty," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. She had spoken to Gerald that morning. The prosecutor offered 4 years in a minimum security facility. If he took it to trial, he was looking at 10. 4 years is a long time, I said. "Not long enough to learn how to be a man," she replied. She didn't sound bitter. She just sounded certain. She reached over and rested her hand on top of mine. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the marshlands in deep shades of violet and gold. The house was quiet, the debt was settled, and the ledger was closed. We sat together in the fading light and listened to the ocean.